They say the bells of Judson's church rang one last time just before the water swallowed the town. In the fall of 1944, the valley was full of sound. Men shouted on scaffolds. Trucks rolled on dirt roads. Children still ran past the little school. At the top of the ridge, the river moved slow and silver. The valley that held Judson smelled of wood smoke and wet earth. Then the machine stopped. Big steel gates began to close at the new dam downriver. People gathered on the hills and watched. The water did not jump. It rose like a quiet tide. First, it touched the low fields. Then it moved into yards. Then it lapped at porches. Families stood on higher ground and watched their own houses become islands. Some people would not leave. Most left because there was no choice. Trucks came with government men. Papers were signed. Things were packed into trunks and wagons. The preacher walked from house to house. He told people to hold on to one another. He told them to pray. On the last morning, a small group gathered by the church. The church sat near the river. The steeple was plain wood. The bell lived high in that steeple for years. It called people to worship. It called them for births and funerals. It had been part of life for decades. When the water came up around the churchyard, the preacher climbed into a boat. People watched from the bank as he stood near the pulpit and spoke with the river close by. He read words about hope. He read words about remembering. Some held hands, some cried. Above them, the bell rang, once, then again. The sound rolled across the water and came back small and thin. As the hours passed, the water touched the church floor. It soaked the hymnals. It climbed into homes. A woman let a photograph float off the porch into the water. A boy chased after it and could not catch it. The bell rang one last time. Then the roof disappeared. Then the steeple bowed down and slid beneath the smooth surface. When the sun set that day, Judson was gone from sight. The valley had not been burned or torn up. It had been covered. Under the quiet lake lay houses, the school steps, cellar holes, old fences, and the places where people had said goodnight for generations. This was not a sudden accident. It was the result of a big decision. The new dam would give electricity. That electricity was needed for factories and for the war. Men in offices far away said the power had to be made. To do it, the river had to be held back. The valley had to become a lake. For the people who left, there were promises. For some families, a new life began somewhere else. For others, the move was the end of things they could never replace. Graves, the places where grandparents and children lay, were supposed to be given care and access. Roads were promised so people could visit. Over the years, some promises were kept and some were not. Still, the lake made a calm surface where a town used to be noisy and busy. Boats now cross the water where the schoolyard once stood. Hikers walk near the high edges and talk about the dam. The bell, the photo, the porch. These things live in memory, in old pictures, and in the hands of people who remember. Here's the question that pulls at the story. Why did a whole town get buried for the sake of power, and what is left of the people who lived there? When the water covers a place, does the memory go with it, or can it come back? When the lake sits high, Judson is only a story told by the old and a name on old maps. But when the lake draws down, sometimes a stone wall or a chimney shows up for a little while, and people remember. That is where this story begins, at the place where the bell rang and then stopped. From here we look back at the town that lived before the water came. The valley where Judson lay was tucked deep in the western North Carolina mountains. Ridges rose steep and green around the little town. A winding river, the Little Tennessee River, cut through fields and woods, quietly carrying water from high places into the valleys. The town of Judson sat where the river's soft bend met the base of the hills. It was a place made by nature and by people who stayed close to the land. In the late 1800s, families moved into the valley. Some were farmers, some cut timber. A sawmill stood near the river's edge, and its whistle blew early in the morning, calling the workers, calling the town to life. Children walked along dirt roads to the one-room schoolhouse. The teacher kept chalk on the board and wrote the letters and numbers for the little ones. After school, the children might run down to where the river curved, skip rocks, feel the cool splash of water on their feet. Mornings smelled like wood smoke and fresh coffee in kitchens. On Sunday, families gathered at the church in their Sunday best. The church was simple white clapboard walls, wooden benches, a steeple that rose just above the rooftops. The bell inside that steeple rang for worship, rang for weddings, rang for funerals. It was the voice of the town. In the summer, the fields were alive. Farmers tended corn, beans, potatoes. They heard the sawmill's steady hum and the train whistle in the distance. In winter, the hills held snow and the kids made sled tracks. Families huddled by stoves, told stories, and planned for spring. Neighbors depended on one another. If someone's roof leaked, a neighbor helped. If the sawmill owner needed extra hands, folks stepped in. The post office was small, but important news from far-off places came in letters, wrapped in stamps, delivered by the mountain roads. The store sold nails, sugar, flour, shoes. Life moved at the pace of seasons, of planting and harvesting, of church and song. A few families stood out. There was the Johnson family. They had lived in the valley for 3 generations. Grandpa Johnson cut timber with his sons. Grandma Johnson planted peaches and apples. The Millers lived by the river. Mrs. Miller held quilting bees in her porch in the evenings. The Smiths ran the general store and always had candy for children. These families knew every ridge, every creek, every ridge shadow at dusk. Children followed the river's edge to fish. They worked in the woods when old enough. Not because they wanted to leave home, they worked because home meant being part of the land. They knew the scent of pine, the rhythm of rain on leaves, and the feeling of harvest time. They listened to the saw blade bite timber, and they listened to the bell ring on Sunday morning. This place was home. It was where grandparents were buried, where children learned to walk and run, where stories passed from old to young. It wasn't perfect, but it had roots. The curves of the river and the long slopes of the hills held people's memories. The land shaped them, and they shaped the land. The geography gave the town its character. Green mountains closed around Judson. Hard dirt roads climbed out of the valley. The Little Tennessee River wound through, fresh and lively. Streams fed it from the heights. The weather changed: fast fog in the morning, clouds over mountains at noon, clear stars at night. On warm evenings, folks sat on porches, looking toward where the light faded behind ridges. Because the town was tucked away, change came slow. When a new car rolled in, when the telephone line finally stretched down the road, people noticed. But mostly life stayed the same generation after generation, doing what their parents did. Farming, cutting timber, worshiping, building homes, raising children. They believed they belonged. They believed the valley held them. And they held the valley. Yet this calm rhythm hid a quiet fact. The same river that gave life could be part of a larger change. They could not imagine how deep and wide that change would reach. For a century, the river gave them life. In 1942, that same river was chosen to take it away. By the end of 1941, Judson's calm rhythm began to shake. The war overseas had changed everything. The U.S. Prossen government needed more power, real, electric power, to build aluminum for airplanes and other war supplies. The Tennessee Valley Authority, called TVA for short, was told to make that power fast. Their plan was to build a giant dam on the Little Tennessee River, right below the town of Judson. At first, people didn't worry much. Folks in Judson had heard talk of projects before. They thought the new dam would just mean some work for local men, maybe better roads. But one cold morning in early 1942, men from TVA drove up the dusty main road. They wore suits and carried clipboards. They knocked on doors and handed out letters. The paper said the land around the river, the land where people's homes and barns stood, would be taken. The words were polite but firm. The government needed the land for the Fontana project. There wasn't a choice. Families could sell now, or it would be condemned later. To people who'd worked the same dirt for generations, those words didn't make sense. How could someone take land where their grandparents were buried? Neighbors gathered on porches, trying to understand. Some said it had to be a mistake. Others said they'd fight it. But slowly, as weeks turned into months, the truth sank in. The government really meant it. The whole valley would be flooded. TVA sent more men with measuring tools. They walked fields, stuck orange flags in the ground, and drew lines on maps. Each flag meant that part of someone's life would be underwater. The sawmill owner realized his shop would be gone. The post office clerk started packing boxes. The preacher prayed for guidance. People didn't all react the same way. Some grew angry. "They can't drown a whole town," one man shouted in the store. Others sat quiet, too stunned to speak. One mother cried every night for a month. A few older folks refused to leave at all. "I was born on this land," one woman told the agents. "I'll die here." But even that promise couldn't stop what was coming. Meetings were held at the schoolhouse. TVA explained how the dam would bring progress. They showed drawings of the big concrete wall and the huge turbines that would turn the river into light. They said the project was for the good of the nation to win the war. People nodded, but not because they agreed. It was because there was nothing they could say to stop it. Soon, the first moving trucks arrived. Families packed up what they could: furniture, quilts, jars of fruit, tools. What didn't fit got left behind. Some buried keepsakes in the yard, thinking they might come back one day. Children watched their parents load wagons, not really understanding why. There were hard choices. The graveyards had to be moved. TVA sent workers to dig up coffins and transfer them to new cemeteries higher on the hills. It was supposed to be done carefully, with respect, but it hurt people deeply to see it happen. Many graves were never moved at all, the markers lost, the names forgotten under the rising water. By the spring of 1944, the valley looked like a ghost of itself. The sawmill was quiet. The store was boarded up. The church bell still rang on Sundays, but fewer and fewer came to hear it. On one of those last Sundays, the preacher gave a sermon that no one would ever forget. He said, "The water is coming, and we can't stop it. But God does not live in buildings. He lives in the hearts that remember." After the service, the people stayed for hours. Some took pictures of the church, the school, their houses. One man cut a small piece of wood from his porch post and put it in his pocket. A young boy wrote his family's name on a wall near the riverbank, hoping it might last. When moving day came, wagons rolled down the muddy road one after another. Families left in groups, heading toward higher ground or nearby towns. They looked back as they went. Smoke rose from chimneys one last time. Dogs barked in empty yards. The air felt heavy and still. Government workers moved in next, taking down what could be reused lumber, bricks, pipes. Houses too close to the waterline were burned to keep them from floating away. By early November, the dam gates were ready. When the order was given, engineers closed the gates. The river stopped its wild run and began to rise, slow but steady. Water crawled across fields, through barns, over fences. Within days, it reached the road and then the first homes. Windows darkened as water filled the rooms. Chickens clucked from a hilltop, confused by the growing lake below. The people who had stayed until the last moment watched from the ridge. They said the sound of the rising water was strange, quiet, but powerful, like breathing. It carried the smell of earth and pine. It carried pieces of old life boards, chairs, broken fences turning slowly as the current moved. The preacher came once more to the church. He took the Bible from the pulpit, then walked outside. He stood on the steps until the water touched his shoes. Behind him, the bell tower cast a reflection in the water. He rang it one final time. The sound spread through the valley, bounced off the ridges, and faded. That evening, Judson was gone. The river had become a lake. The people who once filled its streets were scattered. Some built new homes near Bryson City. Others left the county altogether. Most never saw the valley again. There was no ceremony for the town. No plaque, no farewell sign. The government men filed reports, marked boxes, completed, and moved on to the next project. In papers and maps, the valley became Fontana Reservoir Area. But to the people who once lived there, it was still home even if they could never walk its streets again. Years later, a few came back by boat. They floated over the place where the church had stood. where the bell had rung. One man said he could still hear it in his mind, clear as the day it last rang. Another said he dreamed of walking down Main Street, seeing the old store and school again. Judson had not been lost to time or neglect. It had been drowned on purpose in the name of progress and power. The country got its electricity. The factories stayed bright through the war. But the people who gave up their homes paid the price. The water settled, calm and deep. Fish swam over the old town. The ridges stood guard above, silent witnesses to what had happened. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe before this one disappears again beneath the surface. For decades, nobody spoke of Judson until the water began to draw back. For many years after the water rose, the valley and town were quiet. The steeple, the houses, the school, they all lay under the lake, mostly forgotten. But nature and fate began to pull back the veil. One summer, when the reservoir was drawn down for maintenance, the water level dropped much lower than usual. Some fishermen noticed stone foundations and broken chimneys poking out of the water like old tombstones. They looked across the lake and saw shapes for the first time in decades. The river that once ran still ran, but now you could see what lay beneath. Local hikers and relatives of Old Town residents took boats or kayaks across the lake. They reached the shoreline where the old Main Street had been. They stepped on moss-covered stones and rusted nails, the echo of a home where someone had lived and laughed. A chimney standing alone on a slope of grass became a silent marker. A school foundation wall appeared at low tide. People ran their fingers over the worn bricks and whispered the names they had learned from old photographs. At the Swain County Heritage Museum, volunteers started collecting old black and white photos of Judson. They interviewed former residents or their children. A grandmother remembered dancing at the church social in the 1920s. A man recalled the whistle of the sawmill that once sat by the river's bend. They taped their voices, scanned their pictures, and wrote stories that had waited for decades. Memory rose, just like the water once had. In the 1990s and early 2000s, genealogists and local historians joined in. They traced lines of families who had lived in Judson. They looked at old maps, compared them with the outlines of the lake today. They found the shape of the town buried under water. They found records of land purchases the government made in the 1940s, and letters families wrote before they left. The map of the valley changed, but the people's stories remained. One descendant, a woman named Mary, not her real name for this telling, traveled to the lake with her father. He had lived in Judson as a boy. They sat on the boat in early morning mist. The lake was still. Mary asked him if he could see his old schoolhouse. He pointed to where the water was shallower and said, "Right there, under that ripple." Mary held his hand. He said softly, "This was our home. I never forgot it." They dropped a wreath of wildflowers onto the water. The boat drifted. The flowers floated and then settled on the surface. The father closed his eyes and named his grandparents. Mary thought she heard the church bell, though she could not tell if it came from memory or the valley's hills. Sometimes divers explore the deeper parts of Fontana Lake. They put on heavy gear and descend through the cool water. They swim past trees whose tops now reach the surface, past sunken roads where cars once drove. They find the old foundations of homes. Some even find gravestones that mark the places where people rested before the flood. The divers take photographs. They bring back shapes, shadows, and rusting nails. These underwater ghosts tell part of the story that no paper could fully hold. Each time the lake's level dropped in spring or fall, the story came back. Foundations rose, grass covered them, and people walked on them for a few weeks before the water returned. The shoreline changed. What had been water became land for a little while. Children found old nails or shards of glass. Adults paused and stared. They remembered better than they knew. Piece by piece, Judson was rising again not from the water, but from memory, because now the town was not entirely lost. It had become a chapter in other people's stories. Visitors came with cameras. School classes visited the museum. Historians gave talks. The ghost town beneath the lake turned into a place of quiet pilgrimage, not for swimming or boating, but for remembering. Some people left flowers on the rocks that showed. Some left notes. "We were here." A few placed old photos against the stones. The draws of the lake changed too. Before, it was just recreation, fishing, boating, scenery. Now, part of its draw was what was hidden below. Guides told tales of sawmill whistles and church services. They asked tourists to imagine children skipping stones where the water now hides their footprints. Stories spread beyond Swain County. The tale of Judson's return in memory-captured hearts. People who had never lived there felt connected to something lost and found. Old residents gathered at reunions on the lake's edge. They told the young ones, "This is where our home stood." They pointed to hills that were once their backyards. They told how they ran to the church on Sunday, how the river carried logs, how summers meant apple trees and fall meant harvest. Their voices cracked at times. They said, "We left it behind, but it didn't leave us." In recent years, the Heritage Museum added a wall with names of families from Judson. They hung a bell-shaped sculpture to remind people. Visitors touched it respectfully. They wrote in guest books, "Thank you for remembering." The museum's project gained local attention. Newspapers, blogs, documentaries. The story of this town that disappeared underwater but returned in memory made people ask, what happens when we forget? How do we remember? What is home when the home is gone? Before I tell you what they found beneath Fontana Lake, make sure you subscribe. This part changes everything. And it does change everything for the town of Judson. Because the discovery showed that even when land is gone, people's memories are not. Because when the water drops, the stones, the steps, the town's outline return and say, "We were here." After years of quiet, the story of Judson began to surface again. The people who once left the valley refused to let the town vanish completely. In the decades after the lake covered the land, families spread out. Children grew up in new towns. Some returned only in dreams. But the memory of home never left them. One day, they began to gather at the edges of the lake, at the shady highlands around the ridges, at the old church steeple that sometimes popped above the water at low levels. They told each other, "We are the ones who came from Judson." On the shores near Fontana Village, descendants planted small gatherings. They brought folding chairs, picnic blankets, old photographs. They passed around scrapbook pages showing smiling faces on porches, the church standing tall. Children running along the wood-frame schoolhouse. Some brought the old church bell's image printed on paper. Others brought faded lace from a Sunday dress worn in the 1930s. These were not grand ceremonies, but they were deeply felt. They held hands, told the stories again. In the museum in Swain County, the volunteers built an exhibit. On one wall was the photo of the church in Judson, before the water came. On a glass shelf were nails found in the lake's bottom, a rusted sawmill gear, a children's shoe. Handwritten cards described families, Johnsons, Millers, Smiths, names that once filled that valley. Visitors walked slowly, reading the stories. The exhibit said, "This town was here. These people lived here." Journalists wrote articles. One piece said the town was a ghost under the lake, but the writer corrected it. It is not a ghost, it is a memory alive. Local newspapers in Bryson City and the Smoky Mountains region covered reunions, traveled by boat to cemeteries, carried pictures of family members placing wildflowers on old grave markers. A documentary was made. People stood on high ridges and looked across water and said, "That was our front yard." At one reunion, a ceremony took place. The sun rose pink over Fontana Lake's still surface. Families gathered at the old dock where Judson's ferry used to run. A woman read the names of each family whose land was taken. Johnson, Miller, Smith, Brown. Each name held someone's story. When she said Smith, an elderly man rose, placed his hand on his heart, and looked toward the ridge where his childhood home had been. A young girl held her grandfather's hand, tears in her eyes. She asked, "Will our home ever be back?" He said softly, "No, but our memory will." They rang a small bell borrowed from a nearby church. It was not the original Judson bell, but it carried the weight of that sound. It rang once, then again. The sound traveled across the water. For a moment, It felt like the bell of Judson rang again. People held each other. They said, "We are here. We remember." Some people talked openly of injustice. They said, "Yes, the dam brought power. Yes, the war needed it. But our homes were gone. Our church, our school, our memories." We walked away, but part of us stayed behind. They did not demand anger. They demanded recognition. They said, "If our story matters, then people must know that progress has a cost." The community asked the agencies involved to place signage around the lake. "Here once stood Judson. Here we lived." They petitioned local government, historians, universities. They held public talks. This is our home's story, not just a footnote. At the museum, there are now guided tours. On one weekend each year, families board a boat, cross the lake to the old church site. They step onto a dock built for the event. They walk a short trail to a granite marker placed by descendants. The marker reads, "In memory of the families of Judson, their homes, their church, their lives." People take quiet moments to stand, to look at the water, to say the names of those who lived there. Some leave wildflowers. Some leave stones with names. They photograph the marker. They hug each other. The story of Judson transformed from being an underwater secret into a legacy. Children in school learned about it. Local newspapers ran special features on the town that would not vanish. Graduations, anniversaries, family reunions, people who traced their roots back to Judson displayed old pictures on tables, told the stories of their grandparents fiddling on the porch, of summer picnics by the river, of winter sledding down the hills. They said, "Our roots are still under that water." But Judson's story isn't only about loss. It's about what survives when everything else is gone. Because though the houses are gone, the river changed. The lake rose. The people changed too, grew new lives, but kept the old one inside. The sound of the bell, the school steps, the house front, they live in memories, in voices of children asking about their grandparents, in photographs dusty and faded but alive. If this story touched you, share it so Judson's name is never buried again. Each time someone hears it, the town returns a little more. Each time someone visits the lake, walks the ridge, reads the marker, they affirm that this place mattered. In the end, the reunion ends, the bell stops, the boat pulls away. But the work of remembering continues. Families return, they tell their children. The museum opens new exhibits. Tours are booked. The signage goes up along the highways. Judson Valley, formerly home to this community. The lake remains calm, the water deep, but above and beyond the surface, there is life. Memory, recognition, belonging. Because recognition is not just about a plaque or a ceremony. It is about seeing the people who stayed behind and saying, "We see you, we remember you, your town mattered." And in that remembering, Judson lives again. When you look at Fontana Lake today, it's wide and still. A peaceful surface of water stretching between mountains. Boats float, fish swim, hikers walk the shoreline. But beneath the calm, there are stories that don't rest. One lesson from Judson's story is simple. When progress is measured only by power lines and concrete walls, the people who live in the places changed can be forgotten. The dam gave electricity. The war effort gained steam. But the valley's homes, the schoolhouse, the church, the families they left behind? A cost that cannot be turned off. All across America, there are places like this. Towns filled with people who worked, lived, loved. Then one day, for a dam, a mine, a base, or a freeway, the land changed. They had to move. Their memory stayed. Their home started to fade. The story of Judson stands for many such places. It asks, whose lives count when decisions are made? Fontana Lake is more than a recreation site. It is a symbol of achievement, the tallest dam in the eastern U.S., an engineering triumph. But it is also a symbol of amnesia, when the people and the homes beneath the water are out of view, easily dismissed. When the bell doesn't ring, someone may assume no one is listening. The memory of Judson teaches this: belonging is more than living in a place. It is the ties we make with land, with neighbors, with rituals. It is the smell of wood smoke, the Sunday morning congregation, the sawmill whistle. These things don't vanish when houses drown. They live in stories, in the children of those who left, in photographs folded in boxes, in the names listed on museum walls. There is a moral duty here, to remember the people who were displaced, to tell their story so it is not lost, because forgetting does no one any good. The valley lost a town, but the town lost something worse if it lost its story. And when a place loses its story, the people lose part of themselves. Today, when someone visits the lake, they can enjoy the water, the mountains, the outdoors, but part of what they see is borrowed history. They are standing where lives were lived, lives that were ended, changed, redirected. We can enjoy the benefit of clean power, a calm lake, recreation, and yet honor the people who gave up their home for it. When children ask their parents why there are old stones poking up in the lake when the water is low, it's a chance. It's a chance to say, this land has history. These people mattered. The echo of the church bell might be faint, maybe only in memory, but acknowledging it means the bell still rings somewhere in America's memory. Progress doesn't always have to mean displacement. We can learn from this story. When we build roads, dams, towers, or plants, we can ask, who lives here? What will they lose? How will we remember them? We can build not only structures, but also memory, respect, and justice. For the descendants of Judson, the lake is part of their identity now. They say, our roots are still under that water. They carry the story. They pass photos to grandchildren. They sit quietly on boats and look at hills and tell of porches, schools, the river that used to flow free. Their belonging did not end when the valley flooded. It changed form. It became whisper, memory, legacy. In the summer, when the water is low, the outlines of the town show. Stones, chimneys, steps, silent reminders. Those are the echoes. The river that was dammed is still there. The lake covers it, but the story lies just beneath. And each time someone points to the water and says, a town was here, the echo grows louder. So, the lesson is this. We build the future. We light the lights. We make the power flow, but we must carry the past with us. We must preserve the voices of those who left. We must say the names. We must ring the bell again in memory. If you believe stories like Judson's should never fade, subscribe and help keep them alive. Because the water may have claimed their town, but the sound of those bells faint, imagined, eternal still rings somewhere in America's memory.